Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. Today is June 19, 2026, and it's Juneteenth. So uh, this video isn't about Juneteenth, however. I'm having a discussion with respect to citizenship, right? And what the responsibilities of a citizen are. So, and I realized, I became concerned following a recent discussion with a relative, and I came to realize how Nigerians. I was going to title this Africans. I was going to title this video how why Africans do not make good citizens in the West. Then I realized that well, it would probably be inappropriate because I shouldn't speak for other people. Africa is very diverse. There are over 50 countries in Africa, and I do not know what the mores, the attitudes, and practices are in other nations. I'm from Nigeria. I'm Nigerian descent. I'm an American citizen. I'm a Nigerian American. I can speak with respect to Nigerians because I interact with Nigerians and I know their attitudes. Even though I interact with other Africans as well, but I don't want to give offense. When I say stuff about Nigerians, well, I don't really. I guess Nigerians understand I'm not trying to give offense, but a reason I'm doing this video is because of a conversation I had with, a relative. And a relative, this relative was discussing with me about, my current travails um, with Montgomery County, Maryland, the state of Maryland. I've talked about how I was raided, I was assaulted. It's how I got into doing these videos because I wanted to create awareness since the media failed to carry it, mainstream media. I was raided in my home May 16, 2023, all in violation of the law. But this relative, sort of, as is very typical of Africans and Nigerians, you know, went on to sort of criticize me that, well, there must have been something I could have done to avoid it. I'm sitting in my home where I'm legally supposed to be enjoying my rights of usufruct. That's what I'm supposed to be enjoying. There's no arrest warrant against me. I was the victim of a swatting, a false call by a man called a false emergency call and report to the police, which I was unaware of. The police didn't give me notice, by a man impersonating himself as my uncle, that's Jide Iwariri, Howard University professor, who had been harassing me, right? And so somehow my relative felt, well, if I had moved out of that building, that since the building was already harassing me, I filed a um, complaint against the building, Aon Management. That's Landmark at Glenmont. I was staying at 2301 Glen Allen Avenue, um, Silver Spring, Maryland, zip code 20906, because I had been harassed, right, by the property manager. And so I followed my right and filed a lawsuit. It hadn't become a lawsuit, but I filed a complaint with the Maryland Attorney General, right? The Maryland Attorney General then issued them a notice in April that they would prosecute them unless they got into talks with me, mediation, because I filed a complaint, legal complaint, and the Maryland Attorney General's office started investigating them. That's my landlord. They told me they never responded to them. So the Maryland Attorney General, in fact, let me read part of the complaint I filed. Um, Part of the complaint I filed, you could see. So the Attorney General's office wrote them in April of 2023, just a few weeks before I was swatted, right? Wrote them and said, if we do not hear from you, we will assume that you do not wish to resolve this matter at this time. Okay. Uh, okay, it says, this office wants to consider the views of all parties concerned before deciding on a course of action. Your failure to respond to this final request will limit our ability to resolve this matter amicably. By law, the Consumer Protection Division of the Office of the Attorney General is authorized to initiate administrative and or legal proceedings in response to activities which appear to be in violation of the Consumer Protection Act. If we do not hear from you, we will assume that you do not wish to resolve this matter at this time, and we will determine what procedures are appropriate. Please respond in writing by May 31, 2023. This was dated April. They wrote them in April. Instead, on May 14, 2023, GDY and a neighbor, Gremashumi, first assaulted me and attempted to kidnap me. Then May 16, 2023, the police came to falsely imprison me, assaulted me, tased me, and they removed me from my home. I haven't been back then since that day, since May 16, 2023, when I was removed without notice. I was not in an eviction process, right? So I now learned in court, the building had denied being involved, but the assistant state attorney who filed the false charges against me now said in court that it was the building, the landlord, who ordered the police to remove me, which is illegal, right? It's illegal. That's something called, so you see, there's a case against them, right? There's a pending case. They were being investigated. The investigations had begun. It was after the investigations and they determined that, okay, I had a discrimination case against them that was legitimate. That's when the Attorney General's office now wrote them, right, and asked them, give them an opportunity to respond. They were being investigated by the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, right? I follow the law, so I'm getting somewhere with this. I guess this video is getting longer. I want to start making these videos shorter, so I'm gonna have to break up the video into several portions, so I apologize. I just wanted to be clear anyway. So under the law, right, if it was the building, they were involved, as the assistant state attorney who said in court, and her statement had to be true, because in court she can't, if she made a false statement that, well, it was the building landlord, my landlord, who asked the police to remove me from the building. If she lied about it, that didn't happen, then that would be her committing perjury in court, making a false statement, and it would be called fraud upon the court. It would have been basis to dismiss the case already. There are many reasons to dismiss the case, right? They're false charges, but in any event, I don't want to digress. So the landlord gets the police to remove a tenant that's in a lawsuit, legal actions against them. The Attorney General is pursuing a legal action against them on behalf of the tenant. They get the police to remove. Do you know what that is in the law? That's called obstruction of justice. It's illegal. It's a violation in state law. It's a violation in federal law, right? And because this has to do with my constitutional rights, my liberties, the Department of Justice can get involved, right, and prosecute them, right? It is also a violation of what's called RICO laws, right? RICO laws is racketeering, influence, corrupt organization. So I've done a video discussing RICO. So that's when, for instance, it was created in the time of the mafia, right, to address the mafia. Rudy Giuliani was famous for using the RICO laws to get a lot of mafia people in jail, right? A lot of mafia bosses, right? So back then, if the state attorney, the prosecutor, had a case against the mafia boss, and they were supposed to present a witness the night before the trial, that the witness was supposed to appear on stand to be examined. They suddenly disappear. Nobody knows where they are, right? They suddenly disappear, right? Or they're in hospital. They've been bitten off, so they can't make it, or they die. They're killed. So those are RICO laws, right, where they intimidate with witnesses, harass them, or intimidate them. They, even kill them, in order to prevent the legal proceedings from going on, right? So that's a RICO violation. It's a serious crime. So this relative who was telling me that, well, you should have just left the building, right? that person's a bad citizen of wherever it is they are, right? They're bad citizen of the West. They don't make a good citizen. And it's not atypical of Nigerians, right? It's not, you see, Nigerians haven't come and gotten engaged in this matter. No Nigerian lawyers have come forth and engaged in this matter. The Nigerian embassy, right, connected me to the head of one of the leaders of the Nigerian lawyers or whatever in Maryland, and they've not been able to get a single Nigerian lawyer to represent me, to come to my defense, because this is a legal matter, right? Black Americans, today's Juneteenth, right? Something that we want to know about Black Americans, and a reason why they're actually butting heads with Nigerians, especially. Black Americans are butting heads with Nigerians and African Americans because it's Black Americans who've engaged in the laws that have led to equality, freedoms, and things that new immigrants of African descent are enjoying. Immigrants of African descent, new immigrants of African descent, they haven't engaged with the law. They haven't done anything to move the legal needle or whatever, right? To move it forward, right? With respect to equality and rights. So many times, in fact, I've heard some Black Americans say that these new African immigrants are just parasites, right, of what they did, right? The court cases, the legal cases that they won. From the beginning, Black Americans have been engaged with the law, even when they were slaves, when they were not citizens, right? There's the famous case of Dred Scott. Everybody knows Dred Scott versus Sanford, right? This was a slave who was arguing that, because he had been moved to another territory, right, he was free. So, and this is a clarification I want to make, and a distinction, by the way. Fear of the law is not the same thing as knowledge and knowing the law and obeying it, right? New African immigrants, again, I'm not going to say Africans in general because I don't want my other African nationalities to get their pennies in a bunch, right? Over so I'm focusing on Nigerians, new Nigerian American citizens. They fear the law instead of knowing the law and obeying it, and they're not the same thing. So fearing the law without knowing the law, you're not, then it's not the law you fear. You fear the government, right? The authority that they think is behind the law, right? And a few days ago, June 15th, was the anniversary of the Magna Carta that established, the seminal document that established the rule of law, right? The rule of law says that the king and even the government are subject to the law. Yeah, so the U.S. government is also subject to the law, right? And that's where you see how others, right, other nationalities have been outstanding in challenging the government, right? With respect, challenging the government and creating new interpretations of the law for us and expanding our understanding of our freedoms. It's just like the case of, I want to discuss the case of Afroyim versus Rusk, right? So Afroyim versus Rusk, it's really supposed to be maybe Afroyim versus United States. It's really against United States government, right? But they say Rusk because it was the Secretary of State. So it was really Afroyim versus United States. And at the Supreme Court, he won. At the beginning, he lost. I'm going to discuss the case in detail later on in another video, right? He lost at the district level. So this guy, Afroyim, was an Israeli naturalized American. He came from Poland, right? And he became a naturalized American citizen. But in 1949 or so, he went to Israel after the state of Israel was created. And it turns out he went to vote, right? He went to vote, and the U.S. State Department found out, and when he tried to come back to America to renew his passport, the State Department refused, saying that they had revoked his citizenship. He took them to court, saying that no, they can't do that. The 14th Amendment guarantees him citizenship, that you can't revoke it without his voluntary consent, that they just can't revoke it in absentia without his consent. So he went to the first level of the district court, he lost, filed an appeal, he lost, eventually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with him, right? The Supreme Court agreed with him because there was actually a law passed by Congress, and he challenged all of these things. So this guy was an Israeli American, right? Based, Afroyim. Afroyim was his last name. And the US government had actually passed a law, the Congress, right? And Congress, of course, were the ones who created 14th Amendment. But you have to dig deeper regarding the law. Now, what does a law really say? What does it mean? What are the implications, right? Congress passed a law, the Nationality Act of 1940, that indicated that your citizenship can be stripped if you vote in a foreign country, right? In fact, if you serve in a foreign government, if you go and serve in a foreign government, if you vote, show some kind of allegiance to a foreign government after you became a naturalized citizen, that they can revoke your citizenship. And this was the era of the communist scare. So this was actually the law. There was a law that said that in Congress. But Afroyim challenged that law, saying it's unconstitutional, right? Because it contradicts the 14th Amendment, his 14th Amendment rights. It says he's guaranteed, his citizenship is an entitlement, and the government can't take his citizenship without his voluntary consent. The United States government, the courts, the Supreme Court eventually agreed with him and said, yes, he's right. And this is what established dual citizenship. That's why we have dual citizenship. Even though the government makes you, when you take an oath, it's saying you're revoking, blah, 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 right? But this case would establish dual citizenship. And he overturned, in fact, the courts had sided with the government. There was an earlier case that established, and I'm going to get into those, I'm going to discuss the Afroyim later on, right? So that's knowing the law. It's not fearing the government. It's not fearing the government that makes you obey the law. That's what Nigerians do. Nigerians fear the government, and people have criticized them. You can challenge the law. So I'm in court legally. I'm saying this is my right. Right? I haven't broken the law. And so we have to really understand, as Nigerians, new Nigerian Americans, learn to engage in the law. I don't know why, people really, really fear the government. No, you're not supposed to fear the government, because rule of law says even the government is subject to the law. Again, African Americans have engaged in this law. Again, when they were slaves, when they were not allowed to read. When they were not allowed to read, they knew the law. They would go and learn. Of course, some of them learned secretly how to read. And they knew, because there was a law, right? During the era of slavery, right? Antebellum years, there was a law that said if a slave master took his slave out of slaveholding territories, that slave became free, was free there, because slavery was prohibited over a certain line, over a certain parallel line. You couldn't take a slave out of the slaveholding states and they would still have their slave status. They become free. So, but the thing is, the slave has to know to go to court and file what was called a freedom suit. Black Americans knew this. They understood the law enough to know this. And this was what Dred Scott did, right? I'll do a video discussing Dred Scott at some point, right? So they'd been engaging. In fact, the first, unfortunately though, let me just mention this. The first court case that established permanent slavery, right, chattel slavery in America, that made somebody, an African American, a permanent slave, right, was a lawsuit brought by a Black American. Actually, it wasn't a Black American, it was an African. I know why I didn't want to title this that Africans make bad American citizens. It was actually, he was born in Angola, So his name was Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson was a former slave. He got his freedom. Of course, there was a time that slavery in America, in the American colonies, was not permanent, right? They were just indentured servants, and after a period, they got their freedom. So maybe after 7 years or so, and they have brought whites as well, who were indentured servants as well. The first people to become permanent slaves were the only people in North America were were Africans, Black Americans, Africans, and that was a result of, unfortunately, a lawsuit that it was instigated by a lawsuit brought by a former slave who was actually African, Anthony Johnson. He's said to have been born in Angola, and he, was a slave here, was transported here as a slave, but he got his freedom. And when he got his freedom, he became a wealthy slave owner as well, wealthy planter. So his slave, John Casser, his black slave, John Casser, had assumed that his term period of servitude, as an indentured servant, right, had expired, and so he offered his services to a white planter. So Anthony Johnson went to file a civil suit in the Northampton County Court. This was in 1855. And the court found in his favor that John Casser was still his property, and it was wrong for him to have gone to offer his services to a white planter. And so the court established that John Casser was a permanent slave for life of Anthony Johnson. That's a 1655 court case. In Northampton, Virginia, Northampton County, Virginia. That was what established when an American court first established legalized chattel slavery, right? And it was an African who filed that lawsuit. He knew the law. And so this is something I want to encourage Nigerian Americans, right? Stop fearing the law. Stop fearing the law. Some people use the law and the government as being synonymous, right? So they fear authority figures. They fear the representatives of the law. Fearing the representative of the law is not the same thing as respecting the law, knowing the law. Go and know the law, right? And also engage with the law the way Black Americans have engaged with the law and gotten rights that everybody now enjoys. And so they won't call Nigerian Americans parasites anymore, right? Just enjoying the benefits of the legal struggles that they've engaged with. Again, I've talked about Dred Scott, right? Dred Scott went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that was when Roger Taney from Maryland, he was Chief Justice, filed the obnoxious opined the obnoxious rule, the decision in Dred Scott by the Supreme Court, saying, well, people of African descent are not American citizens. They can never be citizens. Of course, that was overruled over time. So for those saying my taking my landlord to court, right, my reporting them to the law, to the Attorney General, which was investigating them, right, because I was experiencing discrimination. I was standing on my right, my liberty, right? I have equal protection of the law, right? Due process of law, my liberty protected by the 14th Amendment, right? My privacy rights. They violated all of those things. My rights of usufruct. They violated all of those things. We should remember that if Black Americans had not been going to court, they would not have won court decisions, and laws that were enacted by Congress regarding housing, right? Fair Housing Act, which says that you can't be denied housing because of your race. You can't be discriminated against. You can't be harassed. Black Americans, when they moved to certain white neighborhoods, which were, more, not just because they were affluent, but they were safer. They were safer neighborhoods. racist whites who didn't want them to live there, their neighbors would hang nooses on their doors, would intimidate them, would throw bombs into their homes, would burn crosses on their lawns, intimidate them. Black Americans didn't move out. They didn't run out. They go to court. So I'm being harassed by Landmark at Glenmont, by Aon management staff, who happened to have been Black American. It was a property manager, the lecturer's property manager was a Black American who claimed her husband was a state attorney. She was harassing me. She got a cop to come and tell me, oh, she's harassing you, so you should move out and get a better place. No. I'm staying and I'm fighting. I'm reporting to the law. So knowing the law, right, and then obeying it is different from just fearing the government, right? Fearing the government is not going to help you. No, it's not going to help you, right? Know the law. I've been seeing things on social media with, respect to Nigerian Americans, unfortunately. Many have been getting in trouble. I just saw something terrible yesterday again. Nigerian American handcuffed for statutory rape, right? And they're going to be in deportation proceedings. In fact, there was one who committed suicide. He had a green card, right? They're green card holders, but went to sleep with an underage person because they didn't know the law, right? They fear the government. That's not going to help you. Fearing the government is not going to help you. Know the law. Somebody was telling me the other day, this person didn't know that, well, just verifying the age of an underage person, right? Somebody who presents them, who has a fake ID and says, well, they're 20 years old and not really 16, and then they have sex with them and because they're ignorant of their real age, they did their best, that absolves them of statutory rape. No, statutory rape is what's called a strict liability offense, right? So the government, the prosecutor, doesn't care of your knowledge and intents concerning their age. They don't care. They just know that, okay, hey, you slept with an underage person. It doesn't matter that she presented you with a fake ID. So it's a strict liability offense, right? So it also means that, strict liability offense means that mens rea is not required. So for criminal cases in America, there are two things that are needed: actus reus and then mens rea. Mens rea means the intent, guilty mind, the guilty intent, guilty knowledge, right? You intended to commit that crime, right? No, but in statutory rape, mens rea is not required. That intent is not required. The only intent that the prosecutor needs is that you intended to have sex with this person, and that person is underage. The law doesn't care, because it's a strict liability offense, that you did not know what the real age was, right? So even if they present a fake ID to you saying they're 20 but they're really 16, so even if you didn't know, you're still guilty. You can still be prosecuted. You've still committed statutory rape. If you slept with a 16-year-old who presented you with a fake ID saying they're 20 years old when they're really 16 years old, and you're a 30-year-old man, 29-year-old man, you've committed statutory rape, right? And you're going to go to jail and be registered as a sex offender. So ignorance of the law, right, is not a defense, right? Again, even if she gave consent. So that's the thing. Many people think, well, these statutory rape convictions, unfortunately, many people think it means that they forced the girl. No, she may have given consent. She was 16 and she may have presented a fake ID saying she's 20 years old, and she probably gave consent. She came to your house and she did it. You're 16 years old. But the law says no. She was a minor. A minor doesn't have capacity to give consent to have sex. So certain people under the law cannot give consent, just like people who are non-compos mentis, people who are crazy, people who are have dementia, who are crazy, they can't give consent, right? They can't sign a contract, they can't give consent, they can't, they don't have capacity. That's the same thing with an underage person. So I'm seeing these sad cases, right, of kids, of Nigerians who are being arrested, in chains and manacled, and being deported because of statutory rape. They slept with an underage person. Many times, maybe they don't even know. There was a case of a Nigerian, and that was in Maryland a few years ago. He was in deportation proceedings for statutory rape. Following his conviction, he committed suicide. So again, I'm going to stop this video here because it's gotten long. My purpose was to clarify and just plead with Nigerians that look, ignorance of the fear of the government is not the same thing as knowing the law and obeying the law. The government, even the government, as I demonstrated in the case of Afroyim versus Rusk, even the government is subject to the law. You can take the government to court and you can win, because the government too has to follow the Constitution, right? In Afroyim versus Rusk, the government, Congress, which created the 14th Amendment, Congress made a law that contradicted the 14th Amendment. And Afroyim took them all the way to the Supreme Court. So the government can get it wrong sometimes. The government can get it. They're not infallible. This is something you have to know. So know the law, right? You don't have to go to an expensive law school like I did. When I say Nigerians, of course, there's always that slim, again, I don't want to get Nigerians knickers in a twist, because some people will be offended. I'm not disparaging them. I'm just trying to encourage us that, let's be engaged citizens, right, in the West. Like, the West follows the rule of law. There's of course, there'll always be that slim segment of Nigerian Americans who want to engage in the law. I know somebody, I have a friend who is an elderly person. He's wealthy, right? He's a wealthy man. He's a wealthy businessman. And his intent is to go to law school, not to practice law, in his 60s, because he wants to know the law. He's interested in knowing the law. He wants to know the law. So engage with the law, right? Engage with the law. Just don't say you fear the government. You'll get in trouble. They're not going to say because you fear them, they won't put you in trouble. Like, I'm fighting my rights for the Constitution now, because the state of Maryland has broken the law. Right? They've violated the Constitution. They've committed perjury. Rogue agents, senior executives in the Department of Navy, Department of Defense, they've broken the law. I'll do another video just explaining what these people have done and how Jide Warere also obstructed justice, right? By not knowing the law. He's feigned his false, pretentious fear of the government, was misplaced. And he's gotten himself into very serious trouble for obstructing justice and for RICO violations, right? So my name's Olurotimi Osha. I will keep you posted. Thank you.